The rescue. James groaned as he opened his eyes. The sharp pain in his ribs reminded him of what had happened, the crash. His starship, the Stellar Voyager, had been ambushed in deep space. He'd fought valiantly, but when the final blast hit, his escape pod had ejected him onto this strange alien planet. Now he lay on a cold, rocky surface, his body battered and his mind foggy. The sky above was a swirling mix of purple and gold, with two suns casting eerie shadows. James struggled to move, feeling the weight of gravity pressing down harder than it did on Earth. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, and his lungs burned with every shallow gasp. His suit's oxygen tank had run out hours ago. This was it, he thought, his end. But then a shadow fell over him. "Stay still," a soft yet firm voice said. James turned his head slowly, his vision blurry. A figure crouched beside him, a woman, but not human. Her skin shimmered with a faint silver hue, and her eyes were a piercing shade of blue that seemed to glow in the dim light. Her long, flowing hair floated slightly, as if defying gravity. She wasn't like any alien he'd encountered before. Who are you?" James croaked, his voice weak. The alien didn't answer. Instead, she placed a small device on his chest. A soft hum filled the air, and James felt warmth spreading through his body. The pain in his ribs lessened, and his breathing became easier. Whatever she was doing, it was working. "Why are you helping me?" he managed to ask, his curiosity overpowering his fear. The alien girl finally looked into his eyes. "Because I can't let you die here," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something unspoken. James wanted to press her for more, but his body betrayed him. Exhaustion took over, and he slipped into unconsciousness. When James woke again, he was in a small, dimly lit cave. The walls glowed faintly, covered in strange, bioluminescent plants. He sat up slowly, noticing that his wounds had been bandaged with a material that felt both soft and metallic. His head still spun, but he was alive. The alien girl sat across from him, her legs folded gracefully beneath her. She was examining a small holographic device that projected images James couldn't understand. She looked up when she noticed him stirring. "You're awake," she said, setting the device aside. "Yeah," James replied, his voice stronger now. "Thanks to you. I guess I owe you my life." The girl tilted her head slightly, as if amused. "Yes, you do." Her words sent a chill down James's spine. "What do you mean?" The girl stood and walked over to him. She wasn't tall, but there was an undeniable presence about her. She knelt beside him and stared intently into his eyes. "I saved you because I need you," she said. "You're not like the others." James frowned. "What others?" "Humans," she replied, her voice filled with both curiosity and suspicion. "Your kind isn't welcome here, but you're different. I can feel it." James didn't know how to respond. What did she mean by different? And why wasn't humanity welcome on this planet? Questions swirled in his mind, but before he could ask, she stood and gestured for him to follow. "Come with me," she said. "There's something you need to see." James hesitated. His body still ached, and he didn't fully trust her. But what choice did he have? He was stranded on an alien world with no way to contact his crew or return to Earth. If this girl had answers, or a plan, he needed to know. "All right," he said, struggling to his feet. "Lead the way." The girl led James out of the cave and into a dense, otherworldly forest. The trees were massive, their trunks glowing faintly in the dim light. Strange creatures skittered through the underbrush, their eyes reflecting an unnatural light. The air was alive with the hum of energy, and James couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching them. "What's your name?" James asked, trying to break the tense silence. "Alara," she replied without looking back. "And yours?" "James." Alara nodded. James, a strange name. He smirked despite the situation. I could say the same about yours." For the first time, Alara smiled, though it was brief. "We're here," she said, stopping suddenly. James followed her gaze and saw a massive structure in the distance. It was unlike anything he'd seen before. A tower made of black, crystalline material that seemed to absorb the light around it. A faint hum emanated from the structure, sending vibrations through the ground. "What is that?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alara turned to him, her expression serious. "That is why I saved you, and that is where you will repay your debt." James felt his stomach drop. Whatever was inside that tower, it was clear that Alara wasn't telling him everything. But one thing was certain: his survival had come at a cost, and he wasn't sure he was ready to pay it. The unexpected demand. James stared at the towering black structure in the distance. Its crystalline walls seemed to ripple, like a living, breathing entity. The low hum it emitted was unsettling, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. He turned to Alara, who stood with her arms crossed, her glowing blue eyes fixed on the tower. "What's inside there?" James asked, his voice cautious. Alara didn't answer immediately. She stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "A nightmare," she said finally, "but one that must be confronted." James frowned. "And you think I'm the one to do it? I barely survived crashing onto this planet." Alara turned to him, her expression hard. "You're not here by accident, James. You think your crash was random, but it wasn't. The Syndicate, the ones who control that tower, they've been tracking your kind for years." That sent a shiver down James's spine. "Why? What do they want with humans?" Alara hesitated, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "They want what you represent. Innovation, resilience, destruction. They see humans as tools, weapons to be used for their conquest." Her voice softened, and she glanced away. "They destroyed my family, enslaved my people, and now they've turned this planet into their playground." James felt a pang of guilt. He had no idea humanity's presence in the galaxy had caused so much suffering. "I'm sorry, Alara," he said, his tone sincere, "but what can I do? I'm just a soldier, and right now, I'm a broken one." Alara stepped closer, her intense gaze locking onto his. "You underestimate yourself. The Syndicate won't expect a human to fight back. Not here, not now. That gives us an advantage." "An advantage?" James asked, incredulous. "There's just the two of us. You're talking about taking on an entire operation." Alara smirked, a small but determined expression. "It's not just the two of us. There are others who resist, scattered survivors from other planets. They've been waiting for a chance to strike, and with you here, we finally have one." James shook his head, pacing in the clearing. "You're assuming I'll agree to this. I didn't ask to be dragged into your war." Alara's expression hardened. "I saved your life, James. Do you think I did that for nothing?" Her voice carried a weight that silenced him. She stepped closer, her silver skin almost glowing under the twin suns. "You owe me. And I'm not asking for your help. I'm demanding it." James stared at her, his mind racing. He didn't like being cornered, but there was something in her eyes, a mix of pain, anger, and desperation, that he couldn't ignore. Finally, he sighed. "What's the plan?" Alara's expression softened, and for the first time, she looked almost vulnerable. "We infiltrate the tower. It's the Syndicate's main data hub. If we can extract their communication logs and strategic plans, we can expose them to the galaxy. That data is the key to bringing them down." James crossed his arms, still skeptical. "And how do we get in? I doubt they'll just let us walk through the front door." A faint smile tugged at Alara's lips. "We won't need the front door. There's a maintenance shaft on the eastern side of the tower, barely guarded. It leads directly into their control center. From there, we take what we need and get out." James raised an eyebrow. "Sounds simple enough. What's the catch?" Alara hesitated, then looked away. The catch is that the control center is guarded by something dangerous. James felt a knot form in his stomach. Define dangerous. She sighed. The Syndicate uses genetically engineered creatures to guard their most sensitive areas. They're fast, intelligent, and deadly. I've only seen one survive an encounter with them, and he didn't last long. James exhaled sharply. Great. So not only are we breaking into a heavily fortified tower, but we're also fighting monsters along the way. Perfect. Alara stepped closer, her expression firm. This isn't just about revenge, James. It's about survival. For my people, for yours. If we don't act now, the Syndicate will expand their reach, and no one will be safe. James stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't want to be a hero. He never had. But deep down, he knew she was right. If he walked away now, he'd be turning his back on more than just Alara. He'd be abandoning an entire galaxy to its fate. All right, he said finally, his voice steady. I'm in. But if we're going to do this, we do it my way. No unnecessary risks, no rushing in blind. Alara nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Agreed. We'll plan every step. James extended his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Alara took it. Her grip was firm, her skin cool to the touch. For the first time, James felt a strange sense of trust between them. Let's get to work, he said. And with that, the unlikely alliance between a human soldier and an alien girl was forged, setting the stage for a mission that would determine the fate of countless lives. The journey begins. James and Alara stood at the edge of the forest, the shadow of the crystalline tower looming in the distance. The air was thick with tension, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. The hum from the tower was faint here, but James could still feel it in his bones, a persistent reminder of the danger ahead. Alara adjusted the straps on the pack slung over her shoulder, her movements precise and methodical. James noticed how her silver skin seemed to blend with the faint bioluminescent glow of the alien foliage. She moved with a confidence that both reassured and unsettled him. You've done this before, haven't you? James asked, breaking the silence. Alara didn't look at him as she responded. Not exactly. But I've been close enough to know what we're up against. Close enough to run away, you mean? James muttered, more to himself than her. She turned sharply, her glowing blue eyes narrowing. I didn't run, she said, her voice cold. I survived. There's a difference. James held up his hands. All right, point taken. Let's just hope we both survive this time. Alara turned back to the path ahead without another word. James followed, his boots crunching against the soft, moss-like ground. The forest around them was alive with movement. Strange, alien creatures flitting between the glowing trees, their eyes reflecting the light like tiny stars. Some of the creatures watched them, curious but wary, while others scurried away at the sound of their footsteps. What's with the wildlife? James asked, his hand instinctively hovering near the weapon Alara had given him. A sleek, alien-made pistol. They don't seem afraid of us. They're not, Alara said. Most of them have learned to avoid the Syndicate soldiers, but they don't see us as a threat. Yet. Yet, James repeated, frowning. Alara glanced at him, a faint smirk playing on her lips. You'll see. After hours of trekking through the dense forest, they reached a clearing. James stopped to catch his breath, his muscles aching from the unfamiliar gravity. He leaned against a tree, its bark cool and smooth beneath his hand. Alara, however, seemed unaffected. She crouched near the center of the clearing, studying the ground. Do you ever get tired? James asked, his tone half-joking. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Not when I have a mission. James chuckled dryly. Well, I'm glad one of us is built for this. Alara didn't respond. Instead, she motioned for him to join her. Reluctantly, James pushed off the tree and walked over. She pointed to the ground, where faint tracks were visible in the soft dirt. Footprints, she said quietly. Humanoid. James knelt beside her, examining the tracks. Syndicate. Most likely, Alara said. They patrol the forest to keep anyone from getting too close to the tower. James felt a knot form in his stomach. How many? 3, maybe 4, Alara replied. But these tracks are hours old. They've probably moved on. Probably, James echoed, raising an eyebrow. That's not exactly comforting. Alara stood, her gaze scanning the surrounding trees. We'll need to move quickly. If they double back, we'll be caught in the open. James sighed, standing as well. Lead the way, then. You're the expert. As they continued their journey, the forest began to change. The glowing trees grew taller and denser, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the twin suns. The light became dimmer, the shadows deeper. The hum from the tower grew louder, vibrating through the ground with every step. James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder every few minutes, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. Alara seemed unbothered, her focus entirely on the path ahead. Do you feel that? James asked after a while. Alara nodded. The hum. It's the tower's defense system. It emits a frequency that disrupts communication devices and tracking equipment. No, not the hum, James said, his voice low. I mean, like we're not alone. Alara stopped, her head tilting slightly as she listened. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping creatures absent. Her hand drifted to the blade at her side. We're being followed, she said softly. James's heart rate spiked. He drew his pistol, his eyes scanning the shadows. What is it? Syndicate soldiers. Worse, Alara whispered. Hunters. Before James could ask what she meant, a low growl echoed through the trees. It was deep and guttural, sending a chill down his spine. He turned toward the sound, his pistol raised, but he saw nothing. Stay close, Alara said, her voice steady but urgent. She drew her blade, its edge glowing faintly. And whatever you do, don't run. Noted, James muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. The growl came again, closer this time. James caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, something large and fast, circling them. His finger hovered over the trigger. Suddenly, the creature lunged. It was massive, with sleek black fur that seemed to shimmer like oil. Its glowing red eyes locked onto James as it charged. He fired his pistol, the shot illuminating the dark forest for a split second. The creature dodged effortlessly, its movements fluid and unnatural. James, move. Alara shouted, slashing at the creature as it leaped toward him. Her blade connected, and the creature let out a piercing screech before retreating into the shadows. James stumbled back, his chest heaving. What the hell was that? He gasped. A shadow beast, Alara said, her eyes scanning the forest. The Syndicate uses them to hunt intruders. And there's never just one. As if on cue, more growls echoed around them. James cursed under his breath. Great. Any brilliant ideas, Alara? She smirked, her blade at the ready. Try not to die. And with that, the fight for survival truly began. Unveiling the past. The dense forest gradually gave way to a sprawling, barren landscape of jagged rocks and steaming fissures. The air was heavy with the smell of sulfur, and the distant hum of the tower grew louder, more oppressive. James adjusted the strap of his oxygen pack, his breaths shallow but steady. Alara led the way, her movements fluid and purposeful, but James noticed her silence had deepened. What's on your mind? He asked, breaking the heavy quiet. Alara didn't stop walking. This place, she said, her voice tight. It used to be a sanctuary. James frowned, glancing around at the harsh, lifeless terrain. Sanctuary. For what? For my people, Alara said. She stopped abruptly, turning to face him. Her glowing blue eyes shimmered with emotion. Grief and something else he couldn't quite place. Before the Syndicate arrived, This planet was alive, green, vibrant. We called it Sirenellis. James looked around again, trying to imagine the barren wasteland as a paradise. It was almost impossible. What happened? The Syndicate happened. Elara replied, her voice cold. They came with their machines, their weapons, their greed. They tore the land apart, mined it for resources, and polluted the atmosphere. My people tried to fight back, but we were outnumbered and outgunned. Those who survived were enslaved or driven into hiding. James felt a pang of guilt. He'd seen humanity's darker side in his time as a soldier, planets exploited, civilizations uprooted. But this was different. This was systematic annihilation. And the Syndicate. They're still here, controlling everything. Elara nodded. Their tower is the heart of their operations. It's where they store their data, where they plan their next conquests. But it's also where they keep their prisoners. Prisoners? James asked, his stomach tightening. My people, Elara said quietly. What's left of them? James's chest tightened. He couldn't imagine the pain she carried, knowing her people were suffering while she fought to survive. Why didn't you tell me this before? Elara's gaze hardened. Would it have changed anything? You're here now, and that's what matters. The rest is irrelevant. James shook his head. It's not irrelevant. If I'm risking my life, I need to know the whole story. Elara hesitated, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed and sat down on a nearby rock. Fine. You want the truth. The Syndicate didn't just destroy my planet. They destroyed me. James stayed silent, letting her continue at her own pace. I was young when they came, she said, her voice softer now. My family was one of the first to resist. My parents were leaders among our people, strategists, warriors. They believed we could fight back, that we could win. But the Syndicate doesn't fight fair. They don't just kill. They break you. She paused, her eyes distant. They captured us, made us watch as they executed our friends, our neighbors. They kept me alive as a reminder of their power. A trophy. But I escaped. James clenched his fists. How? Elara smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. I outsmarted them, played the role of the obedient prisoner until I saw my chance. Then I ran. But running meant leaving everything behind. My family, my people, my home. The weight of her words hung in the air. James didn't know what to say. He'd faced death countless times, but he couldn't imagine enduring the kind of loss Elara had. I'm sorry, he said finally. No one should have to go through that. Elara stood, her expression unreadable. Sorry doesn't change anything. Action does. That's why we're here, to take back what's ours. James nodded, his resolve hardening. Then let's do it. Let's hit them where it hurts. As they moved closer to the tower, the landscape became even harsher. Steam hissed from cracks in the ground, and the air grew hotter, almost unbearable. Elara led them to a small outcropping of rocks overlooking the tower's perimeter. From their vantage point, James could see rows of Syndicate soldiers patrolling the area. They wore sleek, black armor that reflected the tower's eerie light. Towering mechanical sentries stomped through the perimeter, scanning the area with glowing red eyes. Looks like a fortress, James muttered, his jaw tightening. How are we supposed to get in? Elara pointed to a narrow vent on the eastern side of the tower, barely visible beneath a series of pipes. That's our way in. The maintenance shaft. It's small, but it'll get us past the perimeter. James squinted at the vent. Small is an understatement. How do we even get close without being seen? Elara smirked, reaching into her pack. She pulled out a small device that emitted a faint, pulsing glow. Siren tech. It scrambles their sensors, gives us a small window to move undetected. James raised an eyebrow. And you're just pulling this out now? I told you, Elara said, her tone teasing. I've been planning this for a long time. James couldn't help but chuckle. All right, genius. Let's see if your plan works." As they prepared to move, James glanced at Alara. She was checking the device, her expression focused and determined. Despite everything she'd been through, she hadn't given up. She was a survivor, a fighter. He said, catching her attention. She looked up, surprised. "What?" "You're not alone in this anymore," he said. "Whatever happens, we see it through together." Alara hesitated, then nodded. Together. And with that, they descended into the heart of danger, ready to face whatever awaited them inside the tower. The infiltration. The crystalline tower loomed larger as James and Alara crept through the shadowed underbrush near the perimeter. The pulsating hum of the structure grew louder, vibrating through the ground and into their bones. Every step they took felt heavier, as if the air itself was warning them to turn back. James's grip tightened on his pistol, sweat trickling down his temple despite the cool night air. Alara knelt behind a cluster of jagged rocks, motioning for James to join her. She pulled out the small scrambling device from her pack, its faint glow casting eerie shadows on her silver skin. "This is it," she whispered, her voice steady. "Once I activate this, we'll have exactly 5 minutes before their systems recalibrate. We need to move fast." James nodded, his stomach churning. He'd been in countless battles. But this was different. This wasn't a war zone with clear enemies and allies. This was a fortress filled with unknown dangers. "Are you sure this will work?" he asked, his voice low. Alara smirked, a glimmer of confidence in her glowing blue eyes. "If it doesn't, we'll know pretty quickly." "Great. Reassuring as always," James muttered. Alara pressed a sequence of buttons on the device, and it emitted a soft pulse of light. The hum of the tower seemed to waver for a moment, and the mechanical sentries patrolling the perimeter stuttered, their glowing red eyes dimming slightly. "Now," Alara said, darting forward without hesitation. James followed close behind, his heart pounding in his chest. They weaved through the gaps in the patrols, staying low and silent. The sentries' movements were sluggish, their scanning beams flickering erratically. It was working, for now. As they neared the maintenance vent, James noticed how small the opening truly was. "You weren't kidding about it being tight," he whispered. Alara crouched beside the vent, prying the cover loose with a tool from her belt. "You'll fit," she said, glancing at him with a teasing grin. "Barely." James rolled his eyes. "Just open it." The vent cover came free with a faint hiss, and Alara slipped inside first, moving with practiced ease. James followed, grunting as he squeezed through the narrow passage. The metal walls were cold against his shoulders, and the faint echo of their movements filled the confined space. "Stay close," Alara whispered, her voice barely audible. The vent stretched on, twisting and turning in a labyrinthine pattern. James felt a bead of sweat run down his back as the air grew warmer. He focused on Alara's silhouette ahead, her movements deliberate and precise. "Do you know where this leads?" James asked, his voice tight with the effort of crawling. "To the control center," Alara replied. "From there, we can access the Syndicate's data servers." "And what about the guards?" James pressed. Alara hesitated before answering. "There will be guards, but that's why we're here, to deal with them." James swallowed hard. Right. No pressure. After what felt like an eternity, the vent opened into a small, dimly lit room filled with blinking consoles and screens. Alara dropped down first, landing silently. She scanned the room with her blade drawn, then motioned for James to follow. Alara sighed, pulling her arm free. "He's an informant, a defector from the Syndicate. He knows their operations better than anyone. Without him, we won't stand a chance at decoding the data I extracted." James's mind raced. A human working for the Syndicate, and now working with Alara. It didn't add up. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" "Because I needed you to trust me," Alara said, her voice firm. "And now, you don't have a choice. If we don't meet him, everything we've done will be for nothing." James wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the sound of approaching drones cut him off. He could see faint red lights flickering in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. "Fine," he said, his voice low and tense, "but this had better be worth it." They emerged from the tunnels into a vast underground cavern. The air was colder here, and the walls were lined with jagged crystals that pulsed faintly with light. In the center of the cavern stood a makeshift camp, a small table covered in maps and equipment, a dim portable light casting a flickering glow. A man stood by the table, his back to them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black tactical suit that looked well-worn. When he turned, James's breath caught. "Commander Strath," James said, his voice filled with disbelief. The man's face broke into a wry smile. "It's been a while, Lieutenant." James took a step forward, his mind reeling. Commander Strath had been his superior during his early years in the Terran fleet. He was a legend, an unflinching leader who had vanished without a trace after a controversial mission. Seeing him here, in the middle of an alien rebellion, was almost too much to process. "You're alive," James said, his voice a mix of relief and confusion. "Alive and kicking," Strath replied, though not exactly in the way the fleet might have hoped. James's eyes narrowed. "You're working with the Syndicate." "I was," Strath admitted, his tone heavy. "But not anymore. I saw what they were doing, what they were planning, and I couldn't stomach it. So I defected. Alara found me before the Syndicate could." James turned to Alara, who stood silently, watching their exchange. "You knew this the whole time." "I told you I had a plan," Alara said simply. James let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "This is insane. Strath, you were one of the fleet's best. How did you end up here?" Strath's expression darkened. "The Syndicate isn't just some alien cartel, James. They have their hands in everything. Human corporations, governments, even parts of the fleet. They're bigger than you can imagine, and they're planning something that could destabilize the entire galaxy." "What kind of plan?" James asked, his stomach tightening. Strath gestured to the data drive in Alara's hand. "That drive holds the key. It's a list of targets, planets, trade routes, military installations. The Syndicate isn't just looking to expand. They're looking to take over." James felt a cold knot of dread forming in his chest. "And Earth." "They've already started," Strath said grimly. "Political manipulation, economic sabotage. It's all part of their strategy. If we don't act fast, Earth will fall, just like Sirenless." The weight of Strath's words hung heavy in the cavern. James glanced at Alara, who stood silently, her face unreadable. For the first time, he understood the depth of her desperation. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about survival. For her people, for his. "What's the next step?" James asked, his voice steady. Strath's expression softened, a hint of relief crossing his face. "We get this data to the Resistance. They have the resources to analyze it, to expose the Syndicate's network." "And the Syndicate?" James asked. "They won't let us just walk out of here." "They'll come for us," Alara said quietly. "They always do." Strath nodded. "But we have an advantage now. They don't know you're here, James. A Terran soldier, fighting alongside a Siren. That's something they won't expect." James clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "Then let's give them something to be afraid of." Alara stepped forward, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "Together." James nodded. "Together." And with that, the three of them set their sights on the battle ahead, ready to face the full force of the Syndicate's wrath. Redemption and Alliance. The Resistance base was buried deep beneath the surface of a barren moon, shielded from Syndicate detection by layers of cloaking technology and geological interference. The cavernous halls were bustling with activity as a mix of alien and human resistance fighters prepared for the Syndicate's inevitable retaliation. The stolen data drive had become the center of attention, and James, Alara, and Commander Strath found themselves at the heart of a brewing storm. James leaned against the wall of the command center, watching as technicians pored over the drive's contents. Holographic projections filled the air, displaying maps, supply routes, and the Syndicate's long list of targeted worlds. The scale of their operation was staggering. "This is bigger than I imagined," James muttered, crossing his arms. Alara stood beside him, her expression tense. "This is only a fraction of their network. We've uncovered their plans, but taking them down will require more than just knowledge." James nodded, his mind racing. He'd always thought of war in terms of battles and strategy, but this was something entirely different. The Syndicate wasn't just an enemy. It was a shadowy empire, woven into the very fabric of galactic society. Commander Strath approached them, his face grim. "We've decoded enough to pinpoint their central hub," he said, gesturing to one of the holographic maps. "It's a massive station orbiting an uncharted planet on the edge of the galaxy. That's where they control their operations, and where their leadership resides." James frowned. "So we take out the station, and we cut off the head of the snake." Strath shook his head. "It's not that simple. The station is heavily fortified. We'd need an armada to even stand a chance of breaching their defenses. And we don't have one," Alara said quietly. "We barely have enough fighters to defend this base." James exhaled sharply, his frustration mounting. There has to be another way. Hours later, James found himself standing alone on a balcony overlooking the base's bustling hangar. Fighters and freighters came and went, their engines roaring as they prepared for the battles ahead. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Alara. "You're quiet," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Just thinking," James replied. "About everything. About how we're supposed to fight something this big with so little." Alara nodded, stepping beside him. "It feels impossible, doesn't it? But we've come this far. We can't stop now." James looked at her, searching her glowing blue eyes for the unshakable confidence she always seemed to carry. "Do you ever doubt yourself, even for a second?" Alara hesitated, her gaze drifting to the hangar below. "All the time," she admitted. "But doubt doesn't change the fact that we have to try. If we don't, who will?" Her words hit James harder than he expected. She wasn't just fighting for her people. She was fighting for everyone the Syndicate had ever oppressed, for every world that had been stolen, every life that had been destroyed. And somehow she'd chosen him to stand beside her. "You're stronger than you realize," James said. "Your people are lucky to have you." Alara turned to him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "And I'm lucky to have you. I couldn't have done any of this without you, James." For a moment, the weight of the war faded, and James felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The next day, the resistance leaders gathered in the main briefing room. Alara and James stood at the front alongside Strath, who began outlining their plan. "We can't take on the Syndicate's station head-on," Strath said. "But we don't need to." The data drive revealed a critical vulnerability, a failsafe built into their power core. "If we can infiltrate the station and overload the core, we can destroy the entire structure from within." Murmurs spread through the room. The plan was bold and dangerous. "How do we get in?" one of the leaders asked. Alara stepped forward. "We'll use the Syndicate's own ships." The drive included their access codes. "If we disguise ourselves as one of their patrols, we can dock undetected." "And once we're inside?" James asked. Strath's expression darkened. "That's where things get tricky. The station is crawling with guards, and the core is located in the most secure section. It'll be a fight every step of the way." James clenched his fists. "Then we make it count." The infiltration went as planned. At first, disguised as a Syndicate patrol, their stolen freighter docked without incident. Alara, James, Strath, and a small team of resistance fighters moved quickly through the station, disabling guards and security systems as they went. The closer they got to the core, the more the tension grew. Finally, they reached the core chamber. The massive glowing structure pulsed with energy, its hum filling the air. Strath and the technicians got to work, planting the explosives that would trigger the overload. But the Syndicate wasn't blind to their presence. The doors burst open, and a wave of heavily armed guards stormed in. Chaos erupted as the resistance fighters engaged them, gunfire and energy blasts lighting up the chamber. James and Alara fought side by side, their movements perfectly in sync. James fired at the advancing guards, while Alara's blade flashed through the air, cutting down anyone who got too close. "We need more time," Strath shouted over the commotion. "You've got 2 minutes," James yelled back, firing at another guard. The battle was brutal, but the resistance held their ground. Finally, Strath gave the signal. "The charges are set. Let's move." The team retreated, fighting their way back to the docks as alarms blared throughout the station. They boarded the stolen freighter just as the countdown reached 0. From the safety of space, they watched as the station erupted in a massive explosion, its fiery remains scattering across the void. Cheers erupted on the freighter, but James and Alara shared a look of quiet relief. They'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. Back at the resistance base, the mood was celebratory, but James couldn't shake the weight of what lay ahead. Alara approached him, her expression unreadable. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," James corrected. Alara smiled, her eyes glowing brighter. "This is just the beginning, James. Are you ready for what comes next?" James met her gaze, his resolve stronger than ever. "With you? Always." And with that, their alliance was solidified, not just as fighters, but as partners in a fight for freedom that would change the galaxy forever.